There is an invisible line that every avoidant lives by, whether they're conscious of it or not. It's not something they talk about, it's not something they announce, but it governs everything. It's the line between emotional control and emotional exposure. On one side, they feel safe. On that side, they can manage perception, regulate connection, and maintain a sense of independence that protects them from being overwhelmed. But the moment they cross that line, they step into uncertainty. And for an avoidant, uncertainty feels like danger. So what do? They stay in control. They keep conversations measured. They reveal just enough to create connection, but never enough to feel vulnerable. They might be present, they might be attentive, they might even seem emotionally available at times, but it's calibrated, it's intentional, it's safe. Because as long as they remain on that side of the line, they don't risk losing themselves. Now here's where it gets interesting. When an avoidant is dealing with most people, that line is non-negotiable. It doesn't matter how kind you are, how patient you are, how much you give, they will not cross it. And this is where a lot of people misunderstand them. They think, if I just love them more, they'll open up. But that's not how this works. Avoidants don't respond to pressure by opening. They respond by retreating. The more you push, the more they reinforce that boundary. But when an avoidant truly loves an empath, something subtle begins to shift. Not dramatically, not in a way that's obvious at first, but it's there. They start stepping closer to that line. And eventually, in small, almost hesitant moments, they cross it. It might look like them saying something they didn't plan to say, admitting something they usually keep hidden, staying in a conversation that makes them uncomfortable instead of shutting down or pulling away. These moments are easy to overlook if you don't understand their significance, but psychologically, they are massive. Because what you're witnessing is not just emotional expression. You're witnessing internal conflict and a conscious decision not to run from it. You have to understand, for an avoidant, exposure feels like losing control. And losing control feels like losing safety. So when they choose to cross that line, even briefly, they are overriding a deeply ingrained pattern that has protected them for years, sometimes decades. That doesn't happen casually. That doesn't happen for just anyone. And here's the part most people miss. They won't cross it cleanly. They'll step over it, feel the intensity, and sometimes retreat again. They might open up one day and become distant the next. Not because what they felt wasn't real, but because it was too real, too unfamiliar, too unregulated. So they go back to what feels safe, trying to make sense of what just happened internally. This is where the empath's awareness becomes critical. If you interpret that retreat as rejection, you'll respond in a way that reinforces their fear. But if you recognize it as part of their process, you create space instead of pressure. And that space is what allows them to come back, not out of obligation, but out of choice. Because ultimately, that's what makes this line so powerful. When an avoidant crosses it for you, they're not being pulled, they're choosing. They're choosing to risk discomfort. They're choosing to step into emotional territory they've spent their entire lives avoiding. And that choice, repeated over time, becomes the foundation of something real. So don't measure their love by how effortlessly they open. Measure it by the moments they choose not to close. Avoidants don't actually fear love in the way most people assume. That's the first misunderstanding that creates so much confusion in relationships like this. It's not love itself that overwhelms them, it's what love demands of their internal world. Because love, especially the kind an empath brings, doesn't stay on the surface. It deepens, it expands, it asks to be felt fully. And for an avoidant, that level of emotional intensity can feel like a loss of control over their own nervous system. So what do? They create distance. Not as punishment, not as rejection, but as regulation. Distance is how they stabilize themselves. It's how they breathe again when things start to feel too close, too real, too consuming. And this is where most people misread them. They assume distance means disinterest. But in reality, distance often means overwhelm. Now here's where the empath becomes central to this dynamic. Empaths don't just love, they resonate. They feel what is unspoken. They hold emotional space in a way that can feel deeply safe, but also deeply exposing. Because an empath doesn't just see your words, they sense your inner world. And for an avoidant, that level of being seen can feel like emotional nakedness. Not in a romantic sense, but in a psychological sense. So when an avoidant meets an empath, their system goes through a contradiction. On one hand, they feel connection. On the other hand, they feel exposed. And that contradiction creates movement. Approach, then withdrawal, intimacy, then distance. not randomness, but regulation. But when an avoidant truly loves an empath, something begins to change in how they handle that internal tension. They don't stop feeling overwhelmed, but they stop escaping immediately. And that difference is everything. Instead of shutting down a conversation, they stay in it a little longer. Instead of disappearing completely, they pause before they withdraw. Instead of emotionally checking out, they try imperfectly, inconsistently to remain present inside discomfort. And this is not because the discomfort has disappeared. It's because the connection has started to matter more than the escape. Think about what that actually means psychologically. An avoidant is essentially rewiring a lifelong strategy in real time. The strategy says, when intensity rises, exit. But love begins to introduce a new possibility. What if I don't exit and I survive it? That is a profound internal shift. It is not romanticized, it is not smooth, it is often messy, confusing, and non-linear. This is why you'll see avoidants act hot and cold even when they care deeply. One day they lean in emotionally, the next day they retract. It's not because their feelings disappeared, it's because their nervous system is recalibrating. They are learning tolerance for emotional closeness in small, fragmented doses. And each time they stay instead of running, they are expanding their capacity for intimacy. But here's the critical point most people miss. Avoidants don't stay in emotional intensity because it feels good. They stay because the person in front of them has become meaningful enough to endure discomfort for. That is the real threshold. Not comfort, not consistency, but willingness to remain present when their instinct says leave. And for an empath, this is where awareness becomes power. If you chase them when they withdraw, you amplify their overwhelm. If you interpret their pause as abandonment, you introduce pressure into a system that is already trying to stabilize. But if you understand that their distance is often a form of self-regulation, not rejection, you stop becoming part of the pressure and start becoming part of the safety. Because in the end, avoidants don't change through force. They don't open through demand. They open when emotional intensity stops being a threat and starts becoming something they can survive without losing themselves. And when that happens, what once felt unbearable becomes something they begin to return to instead of run from. That is where love stops being theory and becomes transformation. One of the most misunderstood traits in avoidant psychology is their relationship with vulnerability. On the surface, it looks simple. They don't open up, they keep things private, they avoid emotional exposure. But underneath that behavior is something far more complex. It's not that they don't have depth, it's that depth for them has historically been associated with risk. So they develop a strategy. They learn how to be present without being exposed. They learn how to speak without revealing too much. They learn how to connect without surrendering control. And over time, that becomes their emotional language. Controlled disclosure, measured intimacy, carefully filtered truth. To most people, this can feel frustrating. You sense there is more there, but you can't access it. And the assumption becomes, if they really cared, they would open up. But that assumption misses the psychological reality. For an avoidant, opening up is not a matter of willingness, it is a matter of safety. And safety is not determined by logic, it is determined by emotional history. Now here's where the empath changes the equation. An empath doesn't just listen to words, they listen to what is underneath the words. They don't rush, they don't force. They hold emotional space in a way that feels different from typical interaction. And that difference matters more than most people realize. Because avoidants are not unaware of their own emotional depth. They are often highly self-aware. They know what they feel. They simply don't express it easily. So when they encounter someone who can sense them without demanding immediate disclosure, something begins to shift internally. The pressure decreases, the threat perception lowers. And in that lowered pressure environment, vulnerability becomes slightly more possible. But even then, it doesn't happen in a single moment of emotional confession. It happens in fragments, in pieces, in unplanned disclosures that slip out during moments of lowered defense. They might say something personal and then quickly change the subject. They might reveal a fear and then laugh it off as if it didn't matter. They might share a memory they've never shared before, then retreat into silence afterward. And if you are not paying attention, you might miss the significance of those moments entirely. But psychologically, those fragments are massive because they represent something rare. Voluntary emotional exposure without external pressure. For an avoidant, this is not casual. This is not accidental in the deeper sense. Even if it feels spontaneous on the surface, internally it is often preceded by a conflict. One part of them says, don't say this, it's too much. And another part says, this person feels safe enough to risk it. And when the second voice wins, even briefly, that is where real connection begins to form. However, because this is such an unfamiliar state for them, it rarely stabilizes immediately. After moments of vulnerability, you often see retreat, emotional distance, silence, a shift in tone. Not because they regret what they shared, but because they are processing the emotional exposure that just occurred. They are reestablishing equilibrium. This is where many relationships collapse. The empath interprets the retreat as rejection. The avoidant interprets the empath's reaction as pressure. And suddenly, what was a moment of genuine openness becomes a cycle of misunderstanding. But when the empath understands the pattern, something different happens. There is no overreaction, no emotional escalation, just steadiness. And that steadiness is not passive, it is regulating. It signals to the avoidant nervous system that vulnerability did not lead to danger. And over time, that is what builds trust. Not grand emotional declarations, not forced conversations, but repeated experiences of being seen without being overwhelmed. Because for an avoidant, trust is not built through intensity. It is built through survival of intensity. It is built through the realization that I opened up and nothing broke. And once that realization takes hold, they begin to do something they rarely do with most people. They begin to open again, not because they were pulled, but because they now have evidence that it is safe. That is the beginning of real emotional access. Not perfection, not full disclosure, but something far more important, willingness to be seen, one truth at a time. And that is where avoidance stops being a wall and starts becoming a doorway. Avoidants often build their entire identity around one central idea. I don't need anyone. And on the surface, that looks like strength. It looks like independence, self-sufficiency, emotional control. They pride themselves on being able to handle life alone, on not being dependent, on not being emotionally entangled in ways that could compromise their stability. But if you look deeper, that independence is not just a personality trait, it's a protection strategy. It is built over time, usually in response to experiences where closeness felt unpredictable, overwhelming, or unsafe. So they learn to rely on themselves not because connection is meaningless, but because connection once felt risky. And this is why their emotional world is so carefully structured. Dependence is not just avoided, it is actively resisted, because dependence in their internal framework equals vulnerability. And vulnerability, in their experience, can feel like loss of control. So they construct a life where they don't need much. They solve their own problems. They manage their own emotions. They keep their internal world contained. And for a long time, that system works. It creates stability. It creates predictability. It creates distance from emotional overwhelm until they meet an empath. Because an empath doesn't enter that system with force. They don't demand dependence. They don't pressure attachment. They don't try to break independence. Instead, they offer something different: emotional safety, emotional understanding without intrusion, presence without pressure. And that is where something subtle begins to happen inside the avoidant. They don't suddenly abandon their independence. That almost never happens, but they begin to soften around it. They begin to make exceptions without fully realizing it. They start to seek small forms of connection, not dramatic dependency, not emotional collapse, but presence. They might check in more often than they used to. They might share thoughts they normally keep to themselves. They might reach out in moments where they would usually stay silent. And on the surface, these look like small behaviors. But psychologically, they represent something significant. They represent deviation from their core defense strategy. Because every time an avoidant reaches out instead of withdrawing, they are challenging their own internal rule. I handle everything alone. And what makes this even more important is that they don't experience it as dependency in the traditional sense. They experience it as relief, a softening of internal tension, a moment where they don't have to hold everything by themselves. But here's the complexity. They still fear what that means, because once you begin to rely, even slightly, you introduce the possibility of emotional loss. And for someone who has structured their life around emotional self-containment, that possibility can feel destabilizing. So they oscillate. They move forward, then back. They reach out, then retreat. Not because they are playing games, but because two internal systems are colliding, the desire for connection and the fear of losing autonomy. Now, when an empath is present in this dynamic, something crucial happens. The empath doesn't threaten their independence. They don't demand more than what is naturally offered. They don't turn every moment of connection into obligation. And because of that, the avoidant begins to experience something new, connection without captivity. That distinction is life-changing for them, because what they begin to realize, often unconsciously, is that needing someone does not automatically mean losing themselves. That emotional reliance does not have to equal emotional collapse. That closeness can exist without control being taken away. And so they begin to rewire one of their deepest assumptions, slowly, cautiously, not in theory, but in behavior. They start choosing presence over isolation. They start staying in connection a little longer than before. They start allowing emotional support to exist without immediately compensating for it by pulling away. And for an avoidant, this is not a small shift. This is a structural change in how they relate to intimacy itself. But it only happens under one condition, that the connection feels emotionally safe enough to explore without fear of being consumed. Because if independence is their armor, then love is the first experience that makes them consider setting it down. Not because they are forced to, but because for the first time, they begin to feel that they might not need it all the time. And that realization changes everything. Because the moment an avoidant discovers they can stay connected without losing themselves, independence stops being a wall and starts becoming a choice. Consistency is where avoidants reveal more truth than they ever do in words. Not because they are naturally inconsistent people, but because consistency requires emotional regulation, and emotional regulation requires safety. When an avoidant does not feel safe, their connection pattern becomes cyclical. Approach, withdrawal, return. It's not random. It's not manipulation. It's a rhythm built around managing internal intensity. To understand this, you have to stop judging them by the standard of linear emotional behavior. Most people assume that if someone cares, they will show up steadily, predictably, without fluctuation. But avoidants don't operate from emotional linearity. They operate from emotional threshold management. When intensity rises beyond what they can comfortably process, they step back. When it settles, they return. So at the beginning of most relationships, you often see this inconsistency very clearly. They can be warm, engaged, even deeply present one day, and then distant or emotionally unavailable the next. And for the other person, especially an empath, this creates confusion because the empath feels continuity. The avoidant experiences fluctuation. But here's the key insight. When an avoidant does not care, they disappear completely. There is no cycle. There is no return. There is just absence. So paradoxically, inconsistency often means there is something present that is still trying to regulate itself within connection. Now, when an avoidant truly loves an empath, something begins to shift in this rhythm. The pattern does not disappear immediately, but it changes shape. The distance becomes less extreme. The returns become more intentional. The silence becomes shorter, less absolute, less detached. They don't suddenly become perfectly consistent. That is not realistic. But what changes is directionality. Instead of drifting away for long periods, they begin to recalibrate faster. Instead of disappearing completely, they stay loosely connected even during withdrawal. Instead of breaking the thread, they maintain it, and this is where most people miss the deeper meaning. They interpret change only in terms of presence or absence. But with avoidance, the real signal is in the quality of return. Do they come back as if nothing matters, or do they come back as if something still exists between you? Because when an avoidant doesn't care, their return is mechanical or non-existent. But when they do care, their return carries weight. It carries continuity. It carries acknowledgement, even if unspoken. This is where emotional maturity in the empath becomes crucial. If the empath reacts to every withdrawal as abandonment, they unintentionally increase the avoidance internal pressure, because now withdrawal is not just a personal regulation strategy, it becomes a relational consequence. And when that happens, the avoidance system does what it always does under pressure. It expands distance. But when the empath remains steady, something very different happens. The avoidant begins to experience something rare in their relational history, connection that does not punish fluctuation. And that is transformative for them, because slowly their nervous system starts learning a new association. I can step back and the connection is still there. And that realization reduces the urgency of full withdrawal. It allows them to stay partially engaged even when overwhelmed. So over time, consistency begins to evolve, not into perfection, but into stability within imperfection. They may still need space, but they don't sever connection to take it. They may still pull away, but they don't disappear into emotional silence the way they once did. And most importantly, they begin to return with less fear of consequence. And that shift is everything. Because for an avoidant, consistency is not about routine. It is about emotional safety over time. It is about whether connection survives distance. It is about whether closeness still exists after internal chaos settles. And when they begin to trust that it does, their behavior changes naturally. Not because they are being managed, not because they are being corrected, but because their internal system no longer sees connection as something that must be escaped to survive. At that point, consistency stops being something they perform. It becomes something they no longer fear. At the deepest level, the final line an avoidant crosses is not emotional disclosure, not consistency, not even vulnerability in isolation. It is transformation. And that word is important because transformation implies resistance, discomfort, and a willingness to become something unfamiliar. Avoidants are not static personalities. They are adaptive systems. Everything they do, every withdrawal, every emotional delay, every moment of distance is designed to maintain psychological stability. So for them, change is not just behavioral, it is structural. It means reorganizing the way they interpret intimacy, safety, and selfhood. And under normal circumstances, they don't do this for anyone because transformation requires risk. It requires surrendering a system that has worked, even if imperfectly, for years. So most people never see this level of change in them. They see patterns repeating, defenses reinforcing, distance reestablishing itself again and again. But when an avoidant truly loves an empath, something deeper gets activated. Not urgency, not obsession, not emotional dependency in the surface sense, but recognition. A quiet internal awareness that says, this connection is different enough that my usual patterns are not fully serving me anymore. And that is where transformation begins, not as a decision, but as a slow internal negotiation. At first, it looks small. They begin questioning their automatic withdrawal. They pause longer before disappearing. They reflect after emotional reactions instead of escaping them immediately. These are subtle signs, but psychologically, they are massive because what they indicate is the beginning of self-observation inside a system that was previously automatic. And self-observation is the first crack in any defensive structure because once an avoidant starts noticing their own patterns in real time, they are no longer fully controlled by them. There is now a gap between impulse and action, between feeling and escape. And in that gap, something new becomes possible. Choice. But choice is not always comfortable. In fact, for them, it is often more uncomfortable than instinct, because instinct is familiar. Instinct is predictable. Choice introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is exactly what their entire system was designed to avoid. So they resist transformation at first. They oscillate. They return to old behaviors even after moments of awareness. They pull back even after moments of closeness, not because they are insincere, but because integration takes time. Emotional systems do not rewrite themselves instantly, but with the presence of an empath who remains steady, not chasing, not collapsing, not forcing resolution, something begins to stabilize inside them. They start to see that closeness does not always lead to overwhelm, that emotional presence does not always lead to loss of control, that vulnerability does not always result in emotional danger. And slowly, something very rare begins to emerge. Internal trust. Not trust in the other person alone, but trust in their own capacity to remain in connection without losing themselves. That is the real transformation, because at that point, they are no longer just managing relationships.